Raise your hand if you own gold, some gold, any amount of gold, just raise your hand. So gold is unique, and there's vast, vast hoards. People have been hiding gold from the government and from their neighbors for at least 5,000 years.
And what do we make of this?
I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
Please join us for our next live stream on June 30th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we'll take a look at current events, past and future guests, and of course, conversation on precious metals. Please do join us at 9 p.m. Eastern Time this Sunday night, June 30th. I'll see you then. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vieira. Once again, if you're new to our channel or have not already done so, please do subscribe, click on the bell to be notified on new updates, and give us a thumbs up if you like what we do. Once again, as you can see, we are on location. We're at the Safe House, a gold and silver vault in Singapore. And we have with us Keith Weiner, the CEO of Monetary Metals. Keith is also the president of the Gold Standard Institute USA and holds a PhD from the New Austrian School of Economics. Keith, we thank you for being here, and how are you doing today?
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, Keith. Glad you made it all the way to Singapore.
It's a long, long plane flight.
It is. So let's get started by first knowing a little bit about your background and how you got interested in gold and the Austrian School of Economics.
So I'd been a software entrepreneur my whole career. Sold a software company called Diamondware to Nortel Networks. We were the last acquisition they ever did, August 19th, 2008, right before everything went over the edge. So as that crisis unfolded, I started to be drawn to study economics and markets to figure out how to protect myself, because I just had a big transaction. And the more I studied, the more I realized that the world was in crisis and that gold had something to do with the solution. So I wanted my next venture to be part of the solution.
It's well known that there are some people who we won't name that tend to call gold a barbarous relic. What's your opinion on this, Keith? Is gold an outdated asset for our modern times?
You know, I like to look for objective data that anybody can point to and anybody can see to answer questions like that, rather than just giving my opinion. So gold is unique in that virtually all of the gold ever mined in thousands of years of human history. A friend of mine wrote a book called The Dawn of Gold, in which he argues it's 13,000 years that the Neanderthals were picking gold nuggets up from the stream beds in Europe 13,000 years ago. We don't know, it's clearly prehistoric. Virtually all of that gold is still in somebody's hands today. And we continue to produce more, and the market buys and absorbs that without any particular limit. In any normal commodity, whether it's oil, obviously the perishables, wheat and so forth, if there's a little bit of overproduction, you have what's called a glut. And then production slows down or stops and consumption is accelerated. The price obviously crashes until the glut is worked off. There's no such thing as a glut in gold. And so I think you could almost write an entire book of economics on what it means that we continue to accumulate gold without limit. But I would certainly say, among other things, it answers your question, is it a barbarous relic? No, there's still that kind of demand for gold even today.
Another thing about gold, we often hear gold as being a risk-free asset. What is meant by a risk-free asset?
So gold, well, any tangible commodity has the property that it cannot default. If you own, whether it's a classic Ferrari, Picasso painting, a bar of gold, there's no counterparty. There's nobody that has to be smart in operating their business in order to make good on their obligations. Whereas any typical financial asset, if the issuer defaults, whether it's a stock or whether it's a bond, if the issuer goes bankrupt, the investor potentially loses everything. Gold is the bridge between both of those two things. It's a financial asset, so it's like a bond or it's like a currency, but it cannot default. No matter what happens, if you have a bar of gold, you still have a bar of gold.
Still a bit of a current event. Basel III, it was put in place by the G20 as a result of what happened in 2007, 2008, the banking crisis. On April 1st this year, gold was reclassified to being a tier 1 asset from being a tier 3 asset. What does that mean, the difference between a tier 3 and a tier 1?
So tier 1 and tier 3 refer to capital. It's actually the liability side. If you think about everything, to understand a bank, everything is the opposite of how, to the bank, everything is the opposite than it is to the depositor. So if you think of having money in the bank, well, the bank owes you. So from the bank's perspective, that deposit is a liability. So if you're establishing a bank, you can have different kinds of capital. That is how the bank raises its funding in order to do its business. So the regulators love equity capital because there's no obligation to ever repay it back. So if you're the bank, you raise equity capital, the regulators are happy to let you invest your equity capital in anything you well please to do, because there's no risk that in a funding crisis that the bank could be caught up short. So people misunderstand, in the gold community, misunderstand this regulation, and they're thinking, oh, this means that the banks can buy more gold and that the regulators are blessing the purchase of gold. The tier 1 and stuff is referring to how the banks raise their capital, which is their liability. Gold isn't on the liability side. The banks aren't borrowing gold, like selling gold-denominated bonds or anything like that. It's on the asset side of the bank's balance sheet. And there you run into the problem of what's called net stable funding ratio. So to the regulators, and this is true in reality, it's not a regulatory artifact, there's two different kinds of risks that can hit a bank. One risk is funding risk. That is, let's say a bank does the absolute riskiest funding and they borrow in the overnight funding market. What can happen, and what happened in 2008, is those markets dry up. All of those funding sources pull their funding back. But meanwhile, the bank still has a long-term asset. So if you borrow overnight and you buy a 30-year mortgage, you're taking a huge risk that eventually that will happen. And then the regulators worry about, on the asset side, there's default risk, which we just said gold doesn't have. And I think the regulators understand that. But then there's market price volatility risk. So if you borrow $1 million to buy $1 million asset, and the $1 million asset drops and becomes a $900,000 asset, you're insolvent.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, assuming it takes capital off your balance sheet. If that happens to your other assets, you're in trouble. And so the regulators have increased the risk rating that they put on gold, and say that it needs an 85% net stable funding ratio, which means the funding that the bank gets in order to own that gold asset has to be more secure types of funding, which basically increases the opportunity cost for the bank to own gold or a gold-denominated asset, and therefore it's going to make the banks reluctant to be in the gold business. And I think this is part of, we've seen a number of banks leave the gold market.
Yes.
And the most recent, 2 or 3 weeks ago now, SocGen. Right? So one by one, the banks are saying, this is not a great business for us to begin with. It's a marginal little group of 20, 30 people within an enterprise of 200,000 employees, and produces marginal profits. And if the regulators make it more expensive and more annoying to do business, they just say, fine, we'll exit the business. And before that was Scotia Makata. Before that was it BNP or was it Credit Agricole? I forget which one. A couple years ago now. Before that was Deutsche. The banks are pulling out of the business because of this, and that's going to mean higher funding costs for bullion dealers and jewelers and everybody else.
What does the average Joe make of this, where on one hand we're hearing that central banks have been buying up gold left and right over the past, more so than in the past 50 years, and on the other hand, because banks now have a cost associated with holding gold, we're seeing them perhaps not as motivated to be holding gold. So on one hand, they're buying it up. On the other hand, they're not so interested to be in it. What do we make of this?
Well, it's the central banks, I think, that are doing the buying, not the commercial banks. I don't know the regulatory status if you run a central bank, if you have to comply with Basel III. I suppose probably, but I don't know how that works in practice. I think to put that in perspective, it may be true that some of the central banks are buying more than they had, but I don't know that that's a huge driver in the market today. The gold market is very, very big. One of the, and I said before, all the gold ever mined in human history is still in human hands, and that there are a lot of implications to that. One of the implications to that is that all of that gold is potential supply. So people think, if you say gold supply, they think whatever's coming out of the mines, and maybe some clever people will say that, recycling from electronics could be added to that. But all of the gold ever mined in 5,000 years of human history is potential supply at the right price and under the right conditions. And so compared to that supply, what the central banks are buying is, it's a drop in the bucket.
Okay, so I think the banks, they own about 18% of the world's gold, somewhere around there. Okay.
So let me just share an anecdote about that, because
Sure.
I find this very interesting. So I gave a talk in front of a gold prospecting club in Phoenix. These guys go up in their hills and they look for gold. And I know they find it because at the beginning of the meeting, they gave out 3 little nuggets. Somebody who'd contributed to the newsletter, and somebody who was really helpful and welcoming to the newcomers, and a third guy, I don't know what he did. And then they introduced me. I was the keynote speaker. And I said, raise your hand if you own gold, some gold, any amount of gold, just raise your hand. The room was 250, 300 people. Not a single hand went up, including the 3 people that I saw had just were given the gold nugget just a moment ago. And so they're lying by not raising their hand. I said, come on. I said, you know that I'm the president of the Gold Standard Institute. You know I founded Monetary Metals. I'm not from the feds. You know each other. Would you fess up? I mean, come on. Not a single hand went up. And I said, thank you for proving my point. You cannot inventory gold. And I know that, the World Gold Council and others have been very careful in documenting how they measure the stuff, but they can only really get the official stuff. And there's vast, vast hordes that nobody is going to, as I said, fess up to. People have been hiding gold from the government, or from their governments, and from their neighbors for at least 5,000 years. And that's not going to change anytime soon. There's no way to inventory it. So I would just say, whatever the official estimate is, 180,000 tons, just conservatively assume it's some multiple of that. And there's debates whether it's a 2x multiple or a 25 times multiple, but that's a lot more gold than that. And so what the central banks have as a proportion of total is a lot smaller than, again, the official estimate.
Okay, so I guess that will lead us into the recent article that you wrote, the Crime of 33, where you mentioned that President Roosevelt's expropriation of gold in 33 effectively removed the choice for savers to own physical gold versus a derivative of gold, like a bond, perhaps. Can you explain what happened with the crime of 1933 and how it transformed the monetary system?
Yeah, so Roosevelt said, number one, you can't own gold anymore. It will become a criminal act, just like possession of cocaine, as in go to prison. Number two, you have to turn your gold in. Now, they did not go door to door with machine guns and try to take the gold. I don't think that would have worked out real well in America because of guns. But they made it illegal, obviously, to deal in it and trade in it and so forth. So what they do is they force it underground. Number two is he, abrogated the gold clauses. So in one of my articles, I used a picture of this gold bond. I gave a talk at the Harvard Club in New York, and they have all these memorabilia hanging on the walls. And there was this gold bond issued by a railroad company in, I want to say it was 1902 or something, issued by this railroad company and bought by the president and fellows of Harvard University. That's their endowment. It was a 90-something year bond paying 3.5% interest. In 1933, gold clause, and it does say specifically it's $5,000, which at that time, an ounce of gold was, or $20 was just under an ounce of gold. Right. Payable in, I forget what the term was, but the standard gold coin, which would have been the Liberty gold coin at that time. Sure. 1933, that's it. Now it's just $20. Just $5,000. And then, of course, he revalued gold, and so the amount of gold that was worth was cut by, 2/3. So there was a robbery there, But I don't think that that was actually his primary intention, though I'm sure that pleased him, to no end. The intention was he wanted to stop the run on the banks, and he wanted to assert monetary policy. He wanted to push the interest rate down. Now, before 1933, if you went to the bank and said, redeem me, he said, here's my either my passbook savings account or my $20 bill, I want the gold. That forces the bank to sell an asset, sell a bond. So that pushes the bond price down, and the interest rate is the inverse. It's a strict mathematical inverse. It's a seesaw that pushes the interest rate up.
Right.
And FDR wanted the interest rate down. He thought that would be stimulative. And so he wanted to take away the power of the people to do that. So he said, okay, you can't take gold anymore. All the gold clauses are broken. Banks are not redeeming the gold anymore. That's it, you're done. What that does is the most conservative saver, the one who would have had gold at home or in a safety deposit box, is now forced into the open arms of the Treasury bond. Now, isn't that convenient for the government? That now to be a saver has now been, it's like Orwell. What does savings mean? It means handing over your wealth to the government to spend on welfare programs, and in exchange for which you get a piece of paper that says, oh yeah, we promise, absolutely, we'll pay you back.
Okay, so...
Right. So anyway, so the saver becomes disenfranchised, and the government now becomes the conduit for savings to consume.
Okay, so being that Americans love their country, how successful was Roosevelt in taking people's gold, and how much gold did he actually get from the people?
Yeah, I don't have the number offhand, but I believe that even though in those days people were much more trusting, it's hard to imagine just how, maybe you'd use the word gullible, I think it was a more trustworthy culture in those days than now. Even though they were much more trusting then than now, I don't think he got a big percentage of it. So he was able to get anything that was in a bank vault or a professional depository, because when the order was given, that's it. Those doors were locked and the federal agents were there. They also said that you couldn't open your safety deposit box except with a federal agent to look over your shoulder, because they knew people had gold in those boxes. But any gold that was at home or otherwise, obviously out of the country, basically was out of his hands.
Yeah.
And there was a term that was coined around that time, and I love this term, called midnight gardening. So as soon as you say it, you know what it means, right?
Yes.
All of a sudden a new flower appeared in somebody's backyard one midnight, because they would bury it, and in the floorboards and in the wallboards and so forth. So as a percentage, I don't think it was that big a percentage. The official records say how many tons it was that he got. The gold community makes much ado with the fact that the U.S. Treasury has a certain number of gold bars that are 93% gold. They're not 99 point, they're not 3 nines or 4 nines. Right. And that 93% gold comes from melting down that coin, which was alloyed with copper in order to be hard enough to, it's meant for wear.
Right.
But as a percentage, I think not that big.
Okay. So, I mean, with that in mind, history in mind, is it wise perhaps we always hear diversify your assets, and we also hear diversify the location of your assets. Would it be a proper thing to do, let's say if you're in the States or any country for that matter, with that type of history, where you should possibly hold some of your gold outside of your jurisdiction?
I mean, in a certain sense, who could be against mom and apple pie and spreading your eggs into multiple baskets?
Yeah.
I don't personally think that, and I read an article about this, that the U.S. government would confiscate again, because the two reasons that Roosevelt had for doing that confiscation are no longer applicable. Gold has nothing to do with the banks really anymore. It's not a monetary, it's not in the monetary system, so they can affect their monetary policy without gold, and there's no run on the banks due to gold. So I just don't think they care anymore. That said, how can you possibly know what the crazy government is going to do next? I mean, if they can just start saying that, and I don't want to rant too much about this, but Trump said, I don't want to see Mercedes on Fifth Avenue anymore. You don't know what they could do next.
Yeah.
And, it could be the US government, but then there's also the old expression, the watch pot is the one that doesn't boil. Maybe it's other governments that do something completely mad. And maybe the US government continues to bumble along without, doing anything truly horrific like that. We don't know. How can you know?
True. But with the expropriation of gold, do you think that paved the way for Treasury bonds to become the risk-free asset of today?
That was the very definition of it. So you take gold out, and so obviously in those days, if you owned gold, there's not only no default risk, but there was no price risk because the dollar was defined as a certain amount of gold. You take gold out of the system, and then everybody is clamoring for what's the risk-free asset, and the government says, well, of course, it's our piece of paper here.
Yeah.
And so today, financial regulation, the definition of prudence for financial, investment advisors, everything comes back to the Treasury bond. And of course, it isn't risk-free. That's Orwell.
But a lot of the Western governments are relying on money created by their central banks to stay afloat when they are really bankrupt. Do you think we'll need or see gold confiscation by the bankrupt governments in the near future? Like we're already seeing what's going on with Venezuela.
If a government becomes totalitarian and some form of socialism, whether it's national socialism or international socialism, then they tend to confiscate everything that isn't nailed down. So in Venezuela, at the end, they were confiscating businesses, buildings, and everything else. And I would imagine that in a place like that, if they know you have gold, they'll steal it from you. Short of something, and that's a very dark, place. We know from the 1930s how that plays out. Short of something like that, I don't think, from the American context, I don't think gold is really the first choice. If you're going to try to grab assets, there's a really large, juicy plum waiting to be plucked, and that is the individual retirement accounts and 401ks, which is, 14 trillion something, I think, versus the total amount of gold, according to the World Gold Council, is 5.5, 6 trillion worldwide. This is 14 trillion just domestically in the US. And so that's number one, how big it is. Number two, it's already highly regulated, and it's in the hands of a relatively small number of custodians. So all they would have to do, and then number three, if you take something, we have our Constitution and our Bill of Rights that says the government can't take without due process and conviction and all those things. But in the case of a retirement account, all they have to do, and I hate to give anybody an idea, so maybe you should be careful who you air this video to, but all they have to do is say, we're changing the rules by which your account is tax deferred. In order to retain your tax deferred status, from now on, you're going to have, and they can name a percent, we'll probably start small, 10, 20% of your retirement assets have to be in these spiffy new, look, we've just launched a new government retirement bond. And then what they'll do, if they're smart, and I shouldn't give them any ideas, is number one, wait until there's a crisis when the stock market has a big dive, so people are dismayed and overcome and so forth. And number two, offer an unusually high interest rate. So, okay, we've got these retirement bonds that are only eligible in a retirement account, and they're going to pay 6% or something crazy like that. And you have to have, 10, 20% of your retirement account has to be in these bonds. And if they did that, if it was 10%, that gives them $1.4 trillion of loot that they can grab, which is a heck of a lot more than they would ever get if they tried to take the gold. Because at this point, if they said we're taking the gold, what would they get? They'd get a few bank vaults, banks that still have it. They get a few big depositories. Everybody knows where Brinks is. Everybody knows where Loomis is. They grab the big vaults. How much that adds up to, my guess would be tens of billions. Just a lot of money, but compared to the greedy maw of the U.S. government, it's a drop in the bucket. And if they went, I don't think they would get anything from the individuals. And if they try to go door to door, they're going to run into guns, because the correlation of those who have guns and those who have gold is very, very high. So, and then you run into the issues of, would the police truly go along with that? Would the military go along with that? I don't know that they would. It gets very ugly when you say to law enforcement, shoot your countrymen, do they go along with it? I don't think they would. I think that would be very ugly. But they could get a lot out of the retirement accounts very easily.
Okay. With those retirement accounts like 401ks, what's your opinion on being that 401ks, typically they're usually in paper, stocks, bonds, mutual funds. What's your opinion on for people to perhaps take some of that 401k, roll it over into a precious metals IRA? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Whether you own the gold in an IRA, whether you own the gold out of an IRA, gold is your risk-free asset that doesn't default. And we're in a world where the debt is growing exponentially, which means the debtors are not only under growing stress, but it's ludicrous to say, could it possibly be repaid? I mean, 20 or 30 years ago, maybe somebody could have made the argument it could be repaid.
Yeah.
But you look today at, what is it, $22 trillion. There's 350 million people in the US, but a lot of them, obviously the children don't work, the retirees don't work, and so forth. Let's assume there's 100 million people that work in the private sector, because the people that are working for government or government contractors obviously can't support the repayment of it. So what is it, $220,000 to everybody working in the productive sector? Yeah. That's in addition to their mortgages and student loans and auto loans, and there's no way.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to be a creditor, gold is your asset, or silver. Gold and silver are your assets.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay. Today, many people refer to Federal Reserve notes as U.S. dollars. I believe you're on the view that there are no differences between holding the Federal Reserve note or Treasury paper. Can you explain a bit on that view?
Well, I mean, obviously there's some differences, but in this context, the Federal Reserve note is the liability of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
It's what the Federal Reserve issues in order to fund its portfolio of assets, which is the Treasury bond. The Treasury bond being payable in Federal Reserve notes. So it's kind of circular. This is payable in this, which is backed by this, which is payable in this. It's a self-referential, it's a snake eating its tail. And so you say, is there any difference between the head and the tail?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there are some differences. With a bond, the longer the duration of the bond, there's price risk. So it makes for great speculation because we've been in a bull market since '81. So if you pick your buy-in points, it's been a very forgiving, bull market lifts all boats. But in terms of the fundamental risk of the system, I would say there really isn't any meaningful distinction there.
Let's just say we go back to a gold standard. What would be the benefits of a gold standard versus the current fiat system today?
In the gold standard, the debt is not only redeemable, but the investor is empowered in charge. So when they say that, you can't own gold anymore, or gold's not a monetary, you can own gold today, but it's not a monetary asset. They're disenfranchising the saver. So to own a dollar is to be a creditor, whether you know it or not, and whether you like it or not, you are a creditor. And now you're only choosing between different degrees of credit and different risks of different debtors. But in the gold standard, you have the right to say, redeem me. I don't choose to be a creditor today, unless the interest rate is to your liking, and unless the risk is fair. So it's a system that gives a lot more power to the savers, and it becomes tougher, on anybody that wants to borrow, because now they have to prove. So my definition of inflation is the counterfeiting of credit. Yeah. It's a legitimate credit should have four characteristics, which is the lender knows that he's lending, the lender is willing to lend, the borrower has the means to repay and the intent to repay. And today, all four of those elements are missing. When people own a dollar, they're not even aware they're a lender. Yeah. That's a controversial statement. If I say to own a dollar is to be a lender, people would say, "Wait, Keith, what are you talking about? You're nuts." Well, if you study it, you realize, yeah, it's true. So in the gold standard, it's not possible for somebody to get your money without you being aware of it, unless it's theft, and therefore you have to approve it. Now you start to think, wait a minute, why would I lend? This person's not offering me enough interest for the risk. And so that's I would say, probably the principle is it's honesty. Not so much honesty on the quantity, although of course you can't print gold, but honesty on the quality, that you're not just given a blank check to borrow whatever you want and then repay your borrowings with more borrowings. I don't think gold investors historically, tolerated that. I don't think they would tolerate it going forward.
There's a lot of people who do believe that we're headed towards some type of a new monetary system. Do you subscribe to that belief that we may be headed to a new monetary system, and would it have some type of gold backing in some way?
I do. I love that quote from Winston Churchill when he said, something like, "God bless the Americans," because I'm getting the quote wrong, so I'm sure your readers are going to email you and say, "Hey, here's the actual quote." But I'm just off the cuff here. God bless the Americans because, after they try everything else, eventually they do the right thing. And I think the whole world, when this irredeemable credit system fails, which it is failing right now, they're going to go back to gold because there isn't a choice. There's no other kind of irredeemable. You can't replace one irredeemable paper with another. You notice in the Latin American banana republics, if you just look at Venezuela, they have the Bolivar Fuerte and the Bolivar this. They've had like different currencies, and then that one collapses, so they just print a new one. But the new one collapses very quickly. And when this worldwide, and it will be worldwide, and finally hits the U.S. dollar, you're not going to be able to just say, "Here's a new paper currency, give us credit again." Credit will have been wiped out in more ways than one. People won't be trusting. And so it's going to be gold because nothing else is going to work. And so yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I'm going to assume you're preparing for this and you've been buying some gold along the way. How much gold do you have?
There's an old joke in America. I don't know if this translates in the rest of the world. I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
No.
It's funny. We did a survey of subscribers on our website, and we're asking some questions like, how much gold do you have and where do you store it? And we knew that a lot of people would be very touchy. So it was multiple choice, at home in a safety deposit box, at a professional depository. We gave them choice D. I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. And, a big percentage of people checked that box. And so we felt by being self-deprecating about it and by saying it's okay not to tell us, that people would, participate in the rest of the survey, which they did. But nobody talks about that stuff.
Okay. We'll take letter D as the answer. I'd like to stick around for a few more years, Keith. But let's say gold hits 10,000 under two scenarios. One, the world is as it is, or two, the world has gotten a bit chaotic. But gold has hit 10,000. What do you do? Buy, hold, sell?
Well, sell everything and go on a consumer binge. Just kidding. The world, if gold hits 10,000, the world is not going to be as it is today. And I read about this a lot. I think, people who own gold watch the people that own shares and properties, and they think, okay, it's going to be our turn, and gold's going to go up like that, and we're going to be the ones driving the Ferraris, and we're going to be the ones partying on the 57th floor with the negative edge pool and all that. I think if gold hits 10,000, the last thing you're going to want to do is let anybody know that you have any gold.
Yeah.
For number one, and number two, look at Caracas today. If somebody has a Ferrari, they're not going to be willing to show it. It's going to be well hidden. It's going to be a very chaotic world, and there will be hungry, angry, desperate people, with pitchforks and torches.
Oh yeah.
And worse. And that's one of those things. Be careful what you wish for. And that said, unfortunately, I think that is coming, both the chaos and the much higher gold price. But it isn't necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
And the rest of your portfolio is going to be rubbish at that point.
Yeah. Okay, Keith, some pretty interesting opinions. We appreciate that. Can you let our viewers know more about you and what they can find at Monetary Metals?
So Monetary Metals, we publish a lot of information you can't get anywhere else, including the gold forward rate, which was canceled by the LBMA in 2015. We pay interest on gold. So our plan to bring back the gold standard is to offer to pay interest to use gold productively. And if we can scale that up, we define a working gold standard as when anybody who wants to can deposit their gold and earn interest on their gold in gold. So that's what we're trying to do if we scale. That is an investment program open to the public. We're at monetary-metals, plural.com, monetary-metals.com.
Okay, Keith Weiner, we appreciate your time and we hope to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Take care. Thank you for being there.